Well, it's a delight to respond to these four papers. And as I've already mentioned in my welcome, it's a tremendous privilege to host an entire symposium dedicated to the understanding of Muslim philanthropy. And this opening panel is a great place to start, as these scholars have truly engaged the title of this session and have opened up multiple ways to frame Muslim philanthropy and its role within civil society. These papers hold together really quite well despite the diversity of angles and disciplines from which they address the issue: history, Fadi's paper we didn't hear on ethics, philosophy, sociology, current polling data. And what struck me from these papers is the author's success in expanding our field of vision, reminding us that the study of philanthropy, particularly religious philanthropy, is never simply measuring dollars, cents, and donor intent. Philanthropy, religious philanthropy, here Muslim philanthropy in particular, can serve as an entree into much broader and deeper questions about how individuals, institutions, and communities, large and small, engage one another. So in these few minutes, maybe now more minutes, I'll offer brief thoughts on each individual paper in hopes of opening up a conversation with you, the audience, to engage these scholars' good work. Dr. Singer's paper, The Politics of Benevolence, begins by reminding us of the descriptive task of the historian, noting that these questions surrounding philanthropy have existed for centuries, and that this allows historians to interrogate the past to enhance the present and the future. So in defining her term, she frames benevolence as including a broad definition of philanthropy. She also names what she means by politics. Politics are not good or bad. They are certainly more than just what we're seeing in our current presidential election, thank goodness. But they're also simply a part of life, the nature of living in relationship. And Singer rightfully focuses on these politics, group dynamics, and individual relationships, donor, recipient, as well as issues of power, which are so often at the heart of gift exchange in societies. So not only was I struck by the initial broad framing of Singer's article, I also found her particular historical examples instructive. The public kitchen in Jerusalem allowed the Ottomans to find a way into the city's landscape when traditional religious institutions like imperial mosques or madrasas were not allowed. The multiple forms of philanthropy in Istanbul offer a contrast from markets and mosques to hospitals and fountains. She notes that in some sense these philanthropic legacies dotting the landscape can almost be interpreted like a text, which I think is just a fascinating image, a rich reading that we could stop and ponder. So philanthropy is not only reactive, called upon to meet needs when other sectors fall short. In fact, the more modern notion of three sectors doesn't really even translate into Singer's story. Philanthropy is often intertwined with politics and power, creative in the ways in which it takes shape and visually marks how cultures develop. This is all the more interesting as Singer makes the interpretive move from past to present, connecting the prevalence of neoliberal economic policies worldwide, and which she does more fully in the paper. Many have argued that neoliberalism and the contraction of state welfare systems have made the need for philanthropy more necessary. The additional twist Singer offers, however, is the question of whether the prevalent forms of Islamic philanthropy that she's outlined historically make it easier to adapt to these new contexts. In some sense, yes, these forms of elite philanthropy and endowments have a long tradition, and in other ways, the question is, have these cultural norms caught up to match the new political and diverse economic conditions? This leads to a host of intriguing questions, not only for Singer's particular historical examples, but for religious philanthropy broadly. How do we think about the role of traditional religious practices in new forms? What's the role of theology, the interpretation of sacred texts, the interpretation of landscapes of philanthropy, and the evolving practices on cultures and communities? This is a question that many contemporary analysts of philanthropy and fundraising miss, the textured traditions and practices involved. And this is where all of our panelists pick up the conversation. This is where Fadi really pushes us as well, as he thinks about what is a just society and the ethical position of philanthropy. But moving on to Dr. Khan's paper, like his fellow panelists, he seeks to reframe Muslim philanthropy through multiple lenses, and particularly through this mode of a discursive tradition. He critiques the over-politicization and over-securitization of Islamic studies. And while this may be less the case in religious studies, this is true in many other disciplines. His suggestion that Islamic praxis in context is actually depoliticized is an interesting one. And if that allows for an entree into studying global Islam outside the overly political, then practice, often daily practice, is a great place to study. The addition to this line of reasoning to philanthropy, which I find extremely helpful and quite innovative, is to see NGOs, faith-based NGOs, and humanitarianism as the locus for Muslim practice. So in first focusing on community, Sept notes the various connotations of this concept. For Muslims, it might be the global ummah, used either for dawah or jihad or humanitarian solidarity or just more broadly, community. What does that mean for Muslims in non-Islamic states in the West and their philanthropic expectations at home and abroad? So really quite effortlessly, Sept brings in multiple academic debates, from Weber's notions of bureaucratization or the professionalization of NGOs, questions of the secular, notions of public religion, institutional isomorphism among organizations and how this might affect faith-based organizations. And then he applies all these debates within Muslim humanitarianism. There's much more to be said here than Sept had time to cover, but I believe this is an extremely fruitful line of inquiry. Do Muslims, faith-based organizations professionalize in the same way that Christian ones do, or Jewish ones? What does it mean about questions of the secular? What does that mean for religious identity? What does that say, the humanitarian organizations, for the individual donors or their communities as they think about this notion of interpretation of what it means to give or to practice zakat? Sept highlights the multiple tensions within these questions, rightfully so. I hope that one thing we will come away with from our 2 days together is that there are no easy answers to the many questions that we pose. Sept notes that Islamic praxis of philanthropy is evolving under the influence of the relations of political power, theological interpretations, and also institutional discourses of Muslim groups. These issues are complicated because they're complicated. Narrowly focusing on a single variable or approach does a disservice to the complexity of these traditions and cultures. So I commend Sept's attention to practice and to note that belief and practice matters for humanitarian organizations and individual donors. But in attending to these matters, we must realize we are entering into a living tradition with multiple interpretations. And turning to Muslim philanthropy is a factor worth exploring. How one defines oneself as a Muslim, or an American Muslim, or a practicing Muslim, or perhaps even a good Muslim, is a fascinating set of questions that we picked up and are worthy of exploring further. Finally, our last paper leaves us with a contemporary snapshot of American Muslims. I don't have as much to add here because the presentation was quite clear, quite straightforward, but the need for such work should go without explanation. Dispelling myths, demonstrating the diversity of American Muslims along the lines of ethnicity, age, as well as how Muslims are alike and different from their fellow Americans, is a worthy project and one that has great resonance, I think, for field studies. The notions of questions around political and civic engagement, the way we teach philanthropic studies here at the school is definitely, these questions are ripe for discussion. I was struck particularly by the correlation of religious identity with American identity, as well as continued clarity about how these issues of religious attendance and engagement, mosque attendance, for instance, are important measures for the role that religion plays in people's lives, and maybe potentially with people's giving. And I think we have a fascinating set of papers. I think Dr. Bagby's paper will look at something with mosques later that will ask questions of how attendance or membership are measured differently between faith communities and what kind of affiliation, these factors, how that impacts religious giving is something worth exploring more, something we don't know near enough about. But the question, particularly around these important measures of the role religion plays in people's lives, how American Muslims interact with their community locally and broadly, how others perceive of American Muslims, is worthy of our continued conversation. So these papers, individually and together, have really opened up the framing of Muslim philanthropy and civil society. Through multiple vantage points, they've pushed us to consider questions from within specific academic disciplines, but each paper makes the turn to ask bigger questions of how we might study Muslim philanthropy more broadly and what these questions mean for our contemporary context. So I'll look forward to our continued discussion together.
have 30 minutes to engage in Q&A. So maybe I'll walk around to see if people have particular questions to ask.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tyrone Freeman, assistant professor here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. I wanted to ask about the religious nuns phenomenon that's getting a lot of attention and a way of understanding changes in religion in America. Is that playing out at all in Islam in this context? Is it relevant, or is it a useful lens at all? There was a reference to the higher number of younger members in Islam compared to the other religions. So I'm just wondering, is that playing out at all in this context?
You should have a microphone. Yeah, it isn't something that we looked at all. It's a really interesting question, but it isn't something that we looked at in our study. So, yeah, sorry. I don't know if anyone else has anything.
I mean, I'm not qualified to answer this question because I don't do survey work like Mira does. But I think there's a way to think about this question. One way to think about this question is to see loosely how much are youth affiliated with the mosques. Mosque affiliation, which usually mosque or Islamic center, is usually the locus of congregation or faith building or continuation of faith practices. So to that extent, you could say, yes, it might be useful. I think it might be a good, interesting research project. There are, of course, I know personally a lot of Muslims who are non-practicing, who haven't been to the mosque in like 5 years, and they still consider themselves culturally Muslim. It's a term I've started hearing more. So yeah, there are cultural Muslims too, you're right. Some who are crossed over, into being atheists openly, or there are groups within DC. I live in the DC area, so I'm familiar with groups which are sort of over the edge, sort of almost. But I think that's sort of a gray zone, if you will, because it goes into a different territory, especially in the American Muslim context. I don't mean to disparage, any groups or any individual, to each his own. But I think it starts going, the discourse starts going in a different, very unfortunate direction, if you know what I mean. So, but it's a definitely very, very interesting project to pursue.
Unfortunately, our survey size, because of the challenges of surveying such a small minority group, you have to call thousands and thousands of homes to get a Muslim to answer the survey. So our sample size for Muslims during this poll was just over 500. It was about 550, which unfortunately is somewhat too small to dig a little further down in terms of age ranges of mosque attendance and things, which is something we wanted to look at. The one thing we did look at was the split between genders in terms of mosque attendance. And what we found is that women and men attend the mosque equally, that there was no, not one group that went more than another, which I think is important in terms of institution building and making sure that mosques and community centers and other institutions are women friendly, because they do actually go in similar numbers. But in terms of age, we were not able to look at that breakdown.
One thing is an advertisement. We were actually, our distinguished visitor the Lake is hosting this year, Alan Cooperman, is the director for religious research at Pew, and he'll be here October 4th at 5:30 p.m. at the campus center, but actually addressing this question of what the rise of the religiously unaffiliated means for the broader civil society. I think this is a great question, and I think we should ask him that particular question, because I think the category of the nun in many ways is sort of referenced in some sense against a Christian category. And so the way one might frame oneself as Jewish, for instance, or maybe even Muslim, it doesn't match up so much for them to sort of, many people would name themselves as Jewish and claim that as an identity that may not believe in God or practice. And so the same thing might be true in broader context. So I think it's sort of a very Protestantized almost category, but one that might be worth sort of interrogating to see kind of what's in a nun.
I think that what the discussion begins also to address this issue of secular versus religious. And I think that that divide, which many of us grew up with in school, you learned about the French Revolution, talked about the rise of secularism, and but what has always struck me in reading about philanthropy, particularly reading biographies of philanthropists, is within a generation or two, you get to somebody who was profoundly committed to a faith or had faith as a kind of integral part of their growing up, even if they're seen as a symbol of secular giving. So take Andrew Carnegie, for instance. I mean, Andrew Carnegie is seen as one of the big barons and, big part of like the modern philanthropic movement in this country, but he doesn't come from what you would call secular childhood in some ways. I mean, he's educated in a faith tradition, and so to somehow extract him from that and to say, but that's not relevant because then he becomes really rich and he's American, he's part of the industrial leaders. I think that it's too facile a separation of how people formulate who they are and what their giving is about. And I think that this becomes then very important in the notion of cultural. I mean, what's your culture? What forms you culturally and what informs your giving? So within Judaism, I mean, as somebody who grew up going to Sunday school, I wouldn't define myself as a religious or observant person, and yet there were values and there were ethics which really resonated and then were reinforced in other contexts, whether it was reading political philosophy or being the child of a lawyer, growing up during the 1960s in Washington. I mean, there are all kinds of things that then come to reinforce what you're learning. And so then to sort of say you are a secular person, you are a religious person becomes a meaningless statement, except insofar as you confront yourself. The question is, what are you doing? And that's why I think that the notion of, reading texts which are either written or physical and interpreting them. And interpreting praxis are things that we have to do, but we have to do with care. And I think make sure that we're actually interviewing the subjects as much as we are interpreting. And it struck me that one of the most interesting kinds of questions to ask going forward might be to have people, to ask people about how they view other people's practice. So if you gathered a group of different groups of people and said, well, Muslims are doing this and Jews are doing this, and your group, if you're, say, a Protestant, you're doing this, what do you think their giving is about? I mean, do you think it's like your giving? Are you doing the same thing? I think that might be a really interesting conversation to see how much people can find themselves in the other. In going back to where Sharik started us this morning, I mean, are you a part of the other? Is the other actually sharing something that you have, or do you see that, oh, well, they're giving, but it's not quite the same, which is, an instinctively hostile as opposed to instinctively friendly reaction to what other people do. So.
Okay, ISPU, God bless ISPU, is actually involved in a study of Muslim young adults. So we did look at Pew data from their 2011 study. We got the data set and played with it, and we had the ability to look at young adults. And religious nuns are not a factor among young adult Muslims. In fact, our surprise, because we assumed actually that their religiosity, attendance, is religion important in your life, those type of questions that young adult Muslims would score lower than other Muslims. In fact, they did not. In some regards, to other age groups, they scored higher. Their attendance is higher than some other age group. So, and the numbers that said religion is, I forget how the question is phrased, unimportant or something like that, is very low, if I remember, under 10%, So Islamic nuns are still not a factor in the Muslim community. And let me just bring something else up about this whole issue of tradition, secularism. You know, a tradition is a living tradition. There is no such a thing as something that is, you know, transferred as is to another generation. Every generation has to rediscover their tradition. But I think among Muslims in particular, the efficacy of the text cannot be underestimated as a factor in formation of ideas, formation even of culture. Pew's global study, which included American Muslims, over 90% say the Quran is the word of God. Over 90% believe Muhammad is the messenger of God. So in other words, over 90% believe that those words should be listened to, followed. So just sociologically, anthropologically, those texts are having an effect, you know, on Muslims. And therefore, we should not, you know, to me, not dismiss, of course you're not dismissing, but to underestimate that tradition, recognizing that tradition is living and always changes.
Thank you for that. And make sure you introduce yourself. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely acknowledge if the question was, or the comment was directed towards me, the value of understanding a tradition and how it's, you know, as a discursive practice, how it's interpreted, reinterpreted, and of course transformed through practices and of course mentoring and coaching over generations, and of course through other institutions such as a mosque or, you know, peer networks or relatives, friends, and whatnot. So point very well taken. Thank you.
No, thank you, Dr. Bagby. Sometimes the right hand doesn't know all that the left hand knows. Dr. Bagby is our lead researcher on a big project looking at reimagining Muslim spaces. So if you do want to learn more about that, the results will be published fairly soon. And he is the most knowledgeable about all that goes into that. So I will leave it with him.
So I'm David Campbell from Binghamton University. I'll be talking later about Turkish philanthropy, and I had a question for Amy Singer about her presentation. I'm relatively new to Turkish philanthropy, but I was really have been struck in the couple of years I've spent in Turkey with a couple dominant institutional philanthropies. There are only a couple: Koç Foundation and the Sabancı Foundation, and among a few others. And you hinted at the end of your talk about the sort of role of these larger philanthropies that sort of that are building philanthropy in Turkey. But I'd like you to say more about how you see sort of modern institutional philanthropy, these institution builders like Koç and Sabancı in Turkey. Is there anything more?
Okay. Deb can cut me off whenever. Okay, so okay, very briefly. I think that Koç and Sabancı are kind of Gen 1 in many senses. They were part of the first generation of major industrialists. They were given a lot of perks or breaks or room to create wealth by the Turkish state at the time. And they took as their models, they articulate that they took as models, particularly Vehbi Koç, the Ford family, and other people. But they also talk in their biographies about the families that they came from and about the practices that they observed among their parents and grandparents. So they're part of this group that I talk about, but their own narration of who they are tended to emphasize the Western secular practice of philanthropy as a model. I think that what they were actually emphasizing there tended to be the building of institutions as opposed to giving money to individuals on a local basis, and to building things that were not involved in ritual, not involved in prayer, not involved in religious education, that they were creating what they saw as modern secular institutions like schools, like hospitals, and so forth. But they're only two of a larger number of families, and they kind of set the tone for many other families, some of whom also created universities. I mean, Koch and Sabanjo are wealthy on a world scale. But then what happened as well was the creation of foundations and associations that were not named for a particular family. So what was called Denise Fennery, the Lighthouse Foundation, IHAHA, the big humanitarian agency, those are modeled on large global transnational aid agencies. So that, Denise Fennery looked a lot like Oxfam and some of the things that it did and the way it organized itself. So there are multiple kinds of models and also permutations on those that were created and that are Turkey-specific in some ways. So I think it's a very complex kind of field. It's a very rich and interesting field to study, and there are many young Turkish scholars now trying to kind of observe and problematize the way those organizations are acting within Turkish society today, and what it means for the people who are involved. So there's actually an incredibly rich literature, and there are thousands and thousands of practitioners on multiple scales. And I think that the intersection is in the doing, because they're coming to it from different kinds of motivations. But there's some very interesting critiques of the dynamic of it in Turkey, particularly the work of Ayşe Bura, who's an economist at Boğaziçi Bosphorus University, who I think the bottom line for her is basically the state offloaded social welfare into private giving more than it should have over time, and used private giving to kind of bolster social welfare institutions, but also to kind of get the state out of it and kind of shift. I mean, it's sort of a neoliberal kind of move, maybe pre-neoliberal or pre-global neoliberal. I'm not sure how she would, continue the critique, but Ali Charkolu can certainly give us more on that, since that's something that he's really observing closely day to day. So,
Thank you. Come to this side.
Hi, Scott Alexander. I wanted to just do two things, just briefly respond to Ehsan's great intervention, see what he thinks about this. I'm not sure a sort of pious reference to what you're supposed to believe about revelation means that revelation has an impact on your life. I'm not necessarily speaking about Muslims, but I am speaking about Catholics. So you got to be careful on how you interpret when people say the Quran's the word of God, that doesn't automatically mean that they read it, that's important, that it shapes their lives in any meaningful way. Just a caution there. And I would wonder whether the part of the no-none phenomenon for Muslims is most Muslim youth are pretty aware that they're otherized because of their religion, and they have two choices, right? They can either try to assimilate and deny completely who they are, or they can be healthy human beings, which they usually tend to be in terms of my anecdotal experience, right? And kind of affirm, no, I'm a Muslim. I'm not a nun. So I think that might have something to do with with why there might be a real reluctance on young Muslims to say I'm not religious, because that might mean I'm not who I am, and I'm certainly not who I'm being defined by the larger society. And it would be abnegating the responsibility to sort of define for myself who I am and not let people do that. So just throw those things together. My question, I wish I could ask a question to all the papers are so interesting, but I wanted to ask this question because Deborah's the chair of this panel, and Amy, you kind of piqued my interest in a subject I know very little about, in some of your references, and you led us to see some very important things in your analysis, but you never directly talked about how many women philanthropists you mentioned, right? You were talking about Hasaki Sultans, Hiram Sultan, Misri Shah Sultan, and I'm just wondering, and I don't have this completely formulated, but what work is out there, and I don't know your corpus as well as I should because it's incredibly vast, right? But what work is out there about gendered giving, if we can call it that, or gendered spaces, because these imarets, right, they feed people, and the name that's attached to them, right, are names of women, mothers, right, nurturers. Not to, I don't want to be reductionist in some kind of patriarchal way in this, but the symbology of that in terms of, philanthropy and the politics of philanthropy, that women are exercising actually a role in what I would say religious leaders, given the importance of zakat and sadaqah, in the tradition, right? That these women are religious leaders. And I'm also wondering about whether there is a connection, feeding, in my limited association with some of these, Vahide Sultans, they're feeding people. Then I'm also reminded of the, because I actually one of those foreigners that actually like it, Mezir Majunu, that Aisha Hafsa Sultan, was once very ill. A famous pharmacist put together this paste with all these different herbs. You have to really, you either love it or hate it. You get it in Manisa. It's very popular because that's where it comes from, right? But then, it healed her. So then she made large batches of it and distributed it to people. And even today, there's a festival, there's a Messier festival, right, in Manisa, and whenever people eat this thing that is supposed to have curative values, right, they're thinking of a woman philanthropist, a Muslim woman philanthropist. And so the question that I wanted to get to is, how does that compare, that Ottoman gendered philanthropic dynamic compare to contemporary reality? Where are the Muslim women's names? Are they there the way they were there, in the Ottoman period? And et cetera, et cetera. So Emine Erdogan, last I checked, is scheduled to speak at the ISNA convention tomorrow. And given the current political situation, when I inquired as to when the invitation was extended to Emine Erdogan, who's the wife of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it was about 8 months ago, and the reason why it was given to her is because she's a prominent Muslim woman, first lady of a Muslim majority country, who has done incredible work herself for Syrian refugees. Kind of like a Princess Diana sort of figure, right? So I'm just wondering, other Emine Erdogans, or kind of on the Turkish landscape, and then how do we think about the contemporary American U.S. philanthropic landscape and what women are doing?
Okay, briefly, but starting at the end. Yes, there are incredibly prominent Muslim women involved in a variety of kinds of philanthropy. Let's just for a moment remember that philanthropy and culture includes culture and the arts, and go to the Gulf. Think about education and art, which brings us to the princesses from the Athani family. So, yes, on that. The Ottoman case is a little funny. At the imperial level, the only people involved in philanthropy are the Sultan and the women, because the princes can't be involved in philanthropy because it would be seen as a political challenge to do something that they get to do when they get to be Sultan. So you don't see the princes doing anything. They do things once they become sultans. They probably are involved in informal giving from their own palaces, things like that, but they're not building stuff in the landscape. And putting their names on it, so no buildings. The choice of Hurrem Sultan's kitchen in Jerusalem was where I started. That was an accident of historical research that I came to because I'd been working on villages in around Jerusalem. which were part of the endowment. So that's an accident that I got there, and I guess it's another accident that I chose Mihri Shah's foundation in Ayub. Those two kitchens are actually pretty unique because they're not attached to mosque complexes, but if you look at the Suleimani, at the Bayezidi, at the Fatih complex, at all the major mosque complexes, they all have kitchens attached to them, and they're all named for, well, not all of them, there are many of them made by sultans, and then some by sultans' wives, for the same reasons, or princesses. But I think that men and women, I think it's a matter of class. So that there were obligations of status to be involved in philanthropy. And there are relative status, that is, the strongest family in a neighborhood, the major family in a village, that hierarchy and the maintenance of that hierarchy necessarily involves you in what I would call social activism within your village. That is, you're a responsible person. You're responsible in the neighborhood. And whether you're making a foundation to help pay people's taxes or building a well or opening up your private bathhouse for the use of the neighborhood, that's a class thing. And then I think because of the embedded nature of giving practices, that it involved men and women. And people were socialized to do that. And then it becomes a matter of personal choice. And from a historian's point of view, it's an accident whether I can see it or not. Is there a document? Is there a building? Is there a record? So to do statistics in the kind of work I do, I could never do what you do. It's impossible. So then it becomes anecdotal, and you need to be a little bit careful about what kinds of conclusions you draw from anecdote. So, but we actually have a question because we've been listening to the gentleman, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, but you asked the first question about Islamic nuns, and then we had a little discussion about whether it was N-U-N or N-O-N-E, and realized that we had completely misunderstood twice. So we would like you to clarify, are we talking about N-O-N-E? Because I have never seen that phrase. Some people are obviously familiar, some people aren't, but that is the reference? Okay. And a brief definition would be people who are unaffiliated, who would say, yes, I'm Muslim, but I'm unaffiliated? Or who would say, I'm not anything?
You ask them in the survey who they are, they would check none of the above.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And a lot of them include spiritual but not religious. That's not the overlap.
Okay, we probably have time for one more question. Anybody want to ask the last question? Whoops. Okay, any final comments from our panelists?
Let's end on this nun note, because I have a personal anecdote. And the reason I said this conversation goes into a completely wacko territory is because there are groups in New Jersey. Actually, one of my very good friends, he invited me to this group called Ex-Muslims of New Jersey. There is such a group. And you can only imagine the kind of conversations that happen there. It's a lot of Muslim bashing, a lot of Islamophobia, lots of that kind of stuff. So it's a very thin line, in terms of the discourse and conversation that people are having. Again, I'm all for, my friend actually went to this meeting. He said, you should come. I said, of course I'll come, just to see what kind of conversations are going on, right? Because of course there are a lot of people who are, with all due respect to, again, this is an extremely political conversation, but certain countries, certain Muslims are oppressed, certain sectarian, there's a lot of sectarian violence, there's lots of Muslims are not always nice to each other. We need to admit that as well, right? So even the current wars that are going on. So as a result of that, there are a lot of these angry people who are part of these groups or starting these groups. Not all have positive connotations of what it means to be a Muslim. Again, freedom of speech, all of that, to each his own. But I think one needs to be a little more nuanced when asking that question as well. And I think that's where more qualitative work and more in-depth work really has a space. And I think that's a very valid question. And I hope somebody does some research. Maybe I will at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, my apologies. I completely misunderstood your question. But when it comes to the survey that we did, we do a lot of different kinds of research, but just specifically on this survey, Muslims were defined as those who self-identified as Muslim. We didn't question what that meant to them, how often they prayed. I mean, we asked questions of how often they went to the mosque and religious observance, but if they self-identified as Muslim, they were categorized as Muslim. So there was no such thing in our survey as a Muslim nun, because if they said they had no religion, then they had no religion. We didn't ask, well, what were your parents' backgrounds, or do you know what I mean? So yeah, it's, for us, it's impossible to answer that question.
I was just about to excuse the audience. So maybe we'll break for lunch, and if you have additional questions over lunch, we can engage our panelists, but I think we need a round of applause for our discussant and our first panel.